Nkechi sat on her bed, her eyes somber and her heart heavy with worry. Today was the day she and her boyfriend, Thomas, would face the court's verdict on the paternity of her 6-month-old baby, Emmy. As she dressed, she couldn't help but think about the DNA test results that would soon reveal the truth. Her mind wandered back to the countless men who had denied paternity of their children, leaving her determined not to let that happen again. With a deep breath, she finished getting ready and headed to the courtroom. Meanwhile, Thomas had already arrived, his expression nonchalant. He was convinced that Emmy wasn't his, citing the baby's fair complexion as proof, despite Nkechi's assurances that the child's features didn't necessarily determine paternity. As the judge, a stern-looking Nigerian woman, entered the courtroom, the atmosphere became tense. She began to read out the case details, her voice firm but measured. "Mrs. Nkechi, you have brought Mr. Thomas to determine the paternity of your 6-month-old baby, Emmy. You claim that if he is the father, you want him to take responsibility. Is that correct?" Nkechi nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. The judge turned to Thomas. "Is it true that you met Mrs. Nkechi on an online dating app and had sex with her on the first date?" Using protection, Thomas's expression remained stoic as he replied, "Yes, Your Honor." The judge looked curious. "Tell me, Mrs. Nkechi, about your relationship with Mr. Thomas." Nkechi's voice trembled as she began to recount their story. "I met Mr. Thomas on an online dating app. We started talking, and after a few weeks, we met in person. I would always drive 45 minutes to his place just to have fun and good times with him." The judge's eyes narrowed. "For how long did you continue having unprotected sex with him before you became pregnant?" Nkechi's eyes dropped, her voice barely audible. "A month, Your Honor." The judge's expression softened slightly. "What attracted you to this man?" Nkechi's eyes welled up with tears. "It's how funny he is and entertaining. He makes me laugh and happy." The judge turned to Nkechi, her voice firm but gentle. "When you found out you were pregnant, did you tell him?" Nkechi nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, Your Honor, but he blocked me on his phone immediately. He never called again until I gave birth. That was when I called him with a different number to tell him I had given birth." The judge's expression turned stern as she turned to Thomas. "Is that true, Mr. Thomas?" Thomas hesitated before responding, "Yes, Your Honor." The judge's voice was laced with skepticism. "So, why did you do that?" Thomas shrugged. "If she could have sex with me on the first date, then she could simply do that with other men. I just don't believe the child is mine." He paused, his voice filled with conviction. "However, I am dark-skinned, and the baby is light-skinned, and I don't see any of my characteristics there." The judge's expression remained unreadable as she turned to Nkechi. "You are sure you weren't intimate with another man at the time?" Nkechi's voice was firm, her eyes locked on the judge. "Yes, Your Honor, I am sure." Tears rolled down her eyes. The judge turned to Thomas. "So, when Mrs. Nkechi told you she had given birth, what was your reaction?" Thomas's expression remained nonchalant. "I asked her to send me pictures of the baby because I doubted." The judge's eyes narrowed. "And when you saw the pictures, what did you think?" Thomas shrugged. "I didn't see any resemblance." The judge leaned forward, her voice firm. "If the child is yours, what will you do, Mr. Thomas?" Thomas hesitated before responding, "What if he isn't?" The judge's expression turned stern. "I'm asking you, Mr. Thomas, if the child is yours, what will you do?" Thomas's voice was barely above a whisper. I don't know." The judge turned to Nkechi. "And if the child isn't his, what will you do, Mrs. Nkechi?" Nkechi's voice was firm, her eyes locked on the judge. I'll apologize to him, and if it is his, I'd like him to step up as the father. I don't want another child without a father." The judge nodded, her expression unreadable. "There's only one way to find out the truth today." She called upon the clerk to bring in the DNA results. The clerk walked in and handed over the DNA results to the judge. The judge took the sealed envelope, cut it open, and read it out loud. "This DNA result was prepared by DNA Diagnosis, and it reads as follows. In the case of Mr. Thomas and Mrs. Nkechi regarding the paternity of 6-month-old Emmy, the DNA test results indicate that Mr. Thomas, you are not the father." The courtroom erupted into chaos. Everyone couldn't believe the result. Nkechi burst into tears, while Thomas's expression changed from nonchalance to shock. Nkechi apologized profusely to Thomas, who looked stunned. "I am sorry for everything," she said, tears streaming down her face. The judge turned to Nkechi, her expression softening. "Do you know who the father is?" Nkechi nodded, tears still streaming down her face. "Yes, Your Honor. It's my ex-boyfriend. We had sex a week before we broke up, and then I met Thomas. I know what to do now, Your Honor." The judge nodded sympathetically. "Okay, Mrs. Nkechi. You know what to do now." With a bang of her gavel, the courtroom emptied, leaving Nkechi to ponder her next steps.